All right, this is lecture 12B. I'm going to turn to post-classical China. And now the classical age or the era that I've been talking about was basically 500 BCE to 500 CE. And of course, in China, the Han Dynasty, which is sort of the big dynasty of the classical era, collapsed in 220. And China then fell into what was called the Age of Divisions. And so for the last part of the classical era, China was in the Age of Divisions. And this era lasted from 220 to 589. Now, this was not as bad as the previous era before the Han Dynasty that was so disruptive, but it had a similar dynamic. That in the Age of Divisions, you had essentially China got divided between a north and a south. In the north, you had nomads come in from Central Asia and Northern Asia and conquer northern China. The Jianbei nomads came in and they conquered northern China and founded the Wei Dynasty, which lasted a short time from 386 to 534, a little over 100 years, 130 years. And in the south, you saw a succession of 4 dynasties. And so essentially what you're seeing is, you recall that way back at the beginning of the class, we talked about how in China, you had civilization sort of emerge in 2 separate spots, 2 separate zones. There was the Yellow River Valley, which is where civilization really began in China. And in the south, there was the Yangtze River Valley and the rice cultivation. The north was wheat and millet, the south was rice. You see this sort of break happen again as the north, the wheat millet zone with the Yellow River falls under the Wei Dynasty, and in the south, the Yangtze River, etc., you have 4 successive dynasties, each of which is very short-lived. So that's the Age of Divisions, and it comes to an end in 589. And now, during the Age of Divisions, there were a number of smaller kingdoms, and one is a man named Yang Jian, who was the Duke of Sui. Sui was a dukedom in a larger dynasty. He comes to power in 581 as the Duke of Sui, and he takes over his kingdom. He conquers the kingdom, and then over the course of the next 8 years, he conquers the rest of China. And so he founds the Sui dynasty, which is fairly short-lived, 581 to 618. And the Sui dynasty is actually kind of parallel to the Qin dynasty, right? You had this period of disruption and chaos with smaller kingdoms fighting each other, and then this one adventurer sort of rises up from a small principality and takes over all of China and conquers all of China. And he passes it on to his son, just as Qin Shi Huangdi passed it on to his son. But the dynasty doesn't last very long. It only lasts for 37 years. And the reason for that is that Yang Jian, who founded the Sui dynasty, and then his son Sui Yangdi, and just as a side note, traditionally, if you're a ruler of China, you take the family name of your dynasty. And so Yang Jian actually named it the Sui dynasty, and he took a ruling name that was different. It didn't start with Sui, and then his son Sui Yangdi, and so this is the family name, and this is the personal name. And in most Chinese names, you'll see that, and you never know, because often when people translate Chinese names to English, they reverse them so that the family name is second, like it is in English. But sometimes they leave it the way it was, and you have to just know whether you're dealing with a name that's been reversed or not. But in this case, Yang is the family name, Sui is the family name, Li is the family name. I'm keeping them the way the Chinese do it. So Yang Jian, in order to unify China under the Sui dynasty, he has to do a whole bunch of things to try to unify China, and he does a lot of similar things to what the Qin did. He makes Confucianism the official philosophy of his dynasty, and he goes one step farther than that. He actually requires that anybody who's going to work for his government has to pass a civil service exam on Confucianism. So they have to study Confucianism in order to get a job with the government. And this really ramps up the importance of Confucianism in Chinese society, because government jobs are an important path for families to become very important, to amass wealth, to become powerful. And so to base the civil service exams on Confucianism makes knowledge of Confucianism an enormous source of potential power and authority, and everybody starts to learn Confucianism. This allows Confucianism to spread throughout Chinese society much more thoroughly, because everybody now has an incentive to learn about Confucianism. The Sui dynasty also did a whole bunch of massive building projects, including building the Grand Canal, or beginning the Grand Canal. And this was a canal, a huge canal, that would link, and it's still there today, it would link the Yellow and the Yangtze River valleys. And this would make it possible to, now China had a bunch of canals before that had extended closer, these two rivers closer and closer, but the Grand Canal actually connects the two river systems so that it's possible to ship things along the entire length of both rivers and connect them by boat, which enormously helps trade within China. And I want to, just as a side note, make it clear, I've talked about trade along the Silk Roads. I've talked about some trade in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. Before the modern era, before railroads, trade over land was severely limited by the restrictions of overland travel. Basically, overland travel is hard because you can't take large, heavy loads. You're having horses or oxen pull things, or camels carry them, and they simply can't carry huge loads of lumber or huge loads of grain or things like that. But boats can, right? And so canals are enormously important, and rivers are enormously important, because they can transport huge loads of lumber or coal or grain or these sort of big bulk items, or metal, ore or things like that, and they can move those around, right? And so canals and rivers are really important before the advent of railroads, which is much later. So, but building things like the Grand Canal was a huge engineering work, and the Sui dynasty, just like the Qin dynasty, used forced labor to do this. They conscripted labor, and this led to enormous resentment. And this caused the fall of the Sui dynasty, because in 618, somebody who was angry about the forced labor requirements assassinated Sui Yangdi, the second emperor of the Sui dynasty, and the dynasty collapsed. Right. So in a lot of ways, this is like a replay of what happened with the Qin and Han dynasties. That you had this period. In the early part, you had the Warring States period, and then the Qin dynasty conquers everything, but huge building projects and forced labor lead to enormous resentment, and the dynasty collapses after the second emperor, and then you get a much bigger, more stable Han dynasty. Similar thing happening here. You have the Age of Divisions, you have the founding of a new dynasty, huge building projects and forced labor lead to resentment, which caused the dynasty to collapse with the second emperor, and then you get another big empire as a successor to that. And in a lot of ways, what the Han did, they had a much easier time than the Qin did, than Qin Shi Huangdi did, because Qin Shi Huangdi had to build this empire from scratch. He had to conquer everything and then establish government systems and get people to work for him all over his entire empire, and set up offices to allow for communication and taxation, etc. When the Han came along after the Qin, those things were already there. The Qin had established them, so the Han could sort of conquer everything, but they already had a ready-made government system. They just had to bring up what the Qin had done. Similarly, the Sui dynasty had to build this Confucian examination system, the Grand Canals, etc., but they had to establish government communication systems and offices, etc. And then it collapsed when the empire was killed, but it was fairly easy for the Tang dynasty to simply pick up where the Sui left off. So the Tang dynasty was founded by Li Yuan, who named it after his home region, and he conquers. He very quickly conquers China in 618, because there's a period of chaos after the emperor is assassinated, and everybody is scrambling to sort of claim power. He manages to pull it off. So he really just sort of inserts himself at the top of the Sui dynasty. But the Tang dynasty would expand dramatically over the course of its lifetime. It lasts fairly long, 300 years. And the Tang dynasty would be fairly militarily aggressive. Chinese governments throughout history have always had this problem with nomadic peoples on their northwestern borders and their western borders. You've got, the Xiongnu people, the Xianbei people, you've got Mongols, you've got Manchus, you've got Turks, you've got, Uyghurs, there's all sorts of groups that come and go throughout history, but China has sort of a permanent problem with these nomadic groups on their borders that raid the empire and sometimes invade it and things like that. Well, the Tang Dynasty decided the way to handle that was simply to expand. They were just going to move their borders farther and farther into Central Asia, and as a result, as you can see from the map, the Tang Dynasty was extended pretty far into Central Asia, into what today would be called, Russia, Mongolia, etc. And they controlled a huge swath of territory, and they were really successful because of that. And I'm going to talk later about the technological advances that happened under the Tang Dynasty, in particular in the Song Dynasty. But right now I want to turn, in the third part of this lecture, I want to turn to some of the internal problems that the Tang Dynasty had.